Hello, welcome everyone. I'll go ahead and give everyone a few minutes to join our webinar this afternoon before we get started. Just want to welcome you in here and yeah, we'll get started here in just a few minutes. Welcome, welcome everyone. We're just going to give some people another minute to join us before we get started. All right, great. Welcome everyone to today's webinar. I'm Carly Cipolla. I'm the Director of Operations for the American Solar Energy Society, otherwise known as ASES. I'd like to thank you for joining us today. I want to let you all know we will be accepting questions and comments during the webinar. Please send these into the Q&A section of the GoToWebinar platform, and our presenters will answer these at the end of their presentations. We will also be recording this webinar, so don't fret if you have to hop off early or anything like that. We'll have it available on our ASES YouTube channel. So check your email for a link to this later this week. All right, and the American Solar Energy Society, ASES, we are a 501c3 nonprofit organization. Established in 1954, we advocate for sustainable living and 100% renewable energy by sharing information, events, and resources to cultivate community and power progress. All right, welcome to the February webinar. We'll hear from Gilbert Michaud, Assistant Professor of Practice at Ohio University, Joe Clyburn, President of Clyburn and Associates, and Steph Spears, Co-founder and CEO at Solstice. They'll be talking about community solar policy, adoption, and market trends. Before we start the webinar, I would like to just give you all an update about some of our ASES programs. Our 50th Annual National Solar Conference, Solar 2021, Empowering a Sustainable Future, will be taking place in Boulder, Colorado, and online from August 3rd to the 6th this summer. ASES is welcoming nominations for our awards and fellows. If you have anyone to nominate, please head to ases.org/awards to learn more about the procedure for submitting awards and fellow nominations. The deadline is April 15th. The National Solar Tour is getting revamped this year. Be sure to stay tuned and sign up for ASES's email list to stay up to date on the latest news for the National Solar Tour, and be sure to save the dates. The tour this year will be October 2nd and 3rd. I'm also very excited to announce, and the reason that you're seeing this great join the discussion image here is that we have launched the ASES online community. This is a space for the ASES community to collaborate, share content and information, network with each other, and so much more. It's available now, community.ases.org. You can join ASES and participate now. All the information's here for you. If you're already a member of ASES, you can log in with your regular credentials. We're also offering a 20% discount on membership right now, and you can even do a 2-week trial membership if you've never joined ASES before and just want to hop on and try out being a member for a few weeks for free, no cost to you. I also want to note that we will have a chance to win solar and sustainable prizes. After our first year with the platform, you gain engagement points by using this ASES online community, and we have products. We have solar backpacks, solar lights, roll-up solar panel, a lot of really cool, great prizes that you can win simply by engaging on the online community. I also want to note that Gilbert is the leader for our policy division and the ASES's technical divisions. So be sure to join ASES and join that policy technical division to continue the conversation in that community after our webinar today. All right, thanks for taking the time to listen to me and some of our ASES updates. Now it's my pleasure to introduce you to our presenters, Gilbert, Jill, and Steph. So I'll go ahead and hand it over to Gilbert.
Thanks, Carly. And hi, everyone. I am going to share my slides with you all. Okay, hopefully everyone can see my slide deck here. Very pleased to be here and talking about community solar with you. I will be today's facilitator and moderator. I'm also going to give a few opening remarks on community solar, something that is near and dear to me, and I've been working on these issues and studying community solar for quite some time now. My name is Gilbert Michaud. As noted, I am a faculty member at the Voinovich School of Leadership and Public Affairs at Ohio University in Athens, Ohio. We do a lot of applied and engaged research, and so I've been interacting with a lot of different stakeholders, utilities, nonprofit organizations, etc., on these issues. And as Carly noted, we're really excited to have two amazing speakers with us who I'll introduce in a minute, Jill Clyburn and Steph Spears. And a quick shout out and thank you to ASES as well for allowing us to put on this webinar. We'll be talking about policy adoption, market trends, and other exciting things in the world of community solar. Again, I wanted to set the stage for just a minute here and talk about what community solar is. It's interesting. There's a lot of different policies, program design models, etc. And no really uniform or shared definition per se. There's sort of common attributes of community solar, right? We're typically talking about opening market access to folks through a shared solar array of some sort, which is typically off-site. Folks are remotely net metering or being involved in one way or another through purchasing a block or a share in an off-site community solar garden, if you will. Utilities have been doing community solar, third-party developers and many others, and they're getting credited through their bills to the amount of their ownership, right? So this is an image that you see from NREL that talks a little bit about this relationship, and Jill and Steph will both talk a little bit more about this through some of their work and projects as well. A couple of things about community solar in terms of its positive attributes, right? Again, it's really about opening market access through different constraints, right? We're talking about condo owners, HOAs, folks who have shaded roofs, perhaps permitting issues, upfront costs, a lot of different reasons that folks have challenges or constraints to install solar on their own rooftop. And so community solar hopes to overcome those issues, right? It's creating jobs, wages, so there's positive economic development attributes here as well. There's a lot of literature and discussion around energy democracy, local control, community cohesion, which is really important, I think, as well. And then, of course, environmental benefits of this broader energy transition, fossil fuels to renewables, mitigating greenhouse gases, etc. And then, of course, technical benefits. Community solar can be located in strategic locations near substations, near off-takers. There's grid benefits that are involved here as well. Sorry about that. I've studied community solar policy adoption for quite some time now as a policy analyst. It's been really interesting to see where this market might be going in the United States. When we juxtapose community solar state level policy adoption or state legislation with something like net metering, for instance, we have on the net metering side this really interesting sort of S-shaped policy adoption curve, right? Where 30, 40 years ago, we had sort of our more progressive legislatures and state leaders who were early adopters, and then a rapid sort of acceleration of net metering adoption over the 90s and early 2000s. And that's fizzled off to some extent. Folks have been talking about post-net metering policies and where that's going to go. But one interesting research question that has emerged that I've attempted to address in the past is where is community solar going, right, in terms of policy adoption? We're perhaps at the beginning of a similar type of curve, perhaps, and I've done a lot of work through surveys and interviews and other sort of statistical analyses to try to understand where this market is going. In particular, one project that was actually part of my doctoral dissertation was trying to better tease out what some of these barriers and opportunities are for policy adoption of community solar, right? And so I did interviews with a lot of different policy experts, governmental organizations, nonprofit groups, electric utilities, and many others to try to understand where we might be headed here. The utilities themselves and many others have sort of claimed that there's been pushback on adopting community solar policy on behalf of the utilities, grid complications, decreased revenue, some of the challenges that they cite, and they've used their lobbying and money power to push back against community solar in some ways in many states. And there's also opportunities, however, on the other hand, in terms of, this is a learning process. Community solar has been around for about a decade or two. We're learning as we go in terms of these positive attributes and drivers. How can we better communicate and collaborate and increase ultimately attention and participation among groups to talk about the transparency and the multitude of benefits that community solar can bring as we're navigating these complex, policy adoption waters, if you will. And so there's been new advocacy coalitions that have been forming, new venues of collaboration, of course. There's been community solar pushes unfolding before our very eyes right now that we'll talk about here in a minute. And so this has been some interesting work. I'm happy to share resources and these papers with folks if that's of interest. And one other quick point before I turn it over to our speakers here is that, community solar policy, at least, is not uniform, right? It's not a dichotomous, we have no community solar policy and now we do. In many ways, it's more nuanced than that. There's program and project size caps, different provisions and stipulations around who is eligible, LMI provisions, compensation structures, and a lot of other things to note here. And so we've seen some states that have emerged as leaders in community solar. Minnesota comes to mind, of course, Massachusetts, Colorado to some extent, and a few others. I guess my point here is that community solar is not uniform. Some states are doing it better than others, of course. So without further ado, I'm very pleased to introduce our two speakers for today. We're first going to hear from Jill Clyburn of Clyburn and Associates, a good friend who we've been doing some stuff together over the past few years. Excited to have Jill here as a big name nationally in community solar, talking about some of her work that she's been working on most recently, I think, with co-ops and a few others, as well as touching on to some extent the community solar push that's going on currently in New Mexico. And then after Jill, we'll hear from Steph Spears, co-founder and CEO of Solstice, amazing organization that's doing a lot of great projects and programs in various states around the country. So excited to hear from her and some of her work, as well as touching to some extent on this, equity and access issue that I talked about. So without further ado, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and my slides here, and we will turn it over to Jill. And Jill, the floor is yours.
Hey, thanks, Gilbert. I appreciate that. And welcome to everybody on this call. I'm really pleased to be back with the ASES tribe, working on this webinar series. And I guess the first comment that Gilbert made was that New Mexico is involved in community solar legislation. It's always good to start with some breaking news. There is none. I'm here in Santa Fe, New Mexico. The legislature is meeting. It is one of the shortest and most astounding legislatures in the nation. They meet for 60 days. They're almost exactly halfway through. And the community solar legislation that we have here in the state is progressing, but it would be difficult to say whether it's going to succeed at this point. It's a great bill to watch, though. It has most of the community solar would be determined through the Public Regulatory Commission if the legislation passes. So that's a nice handoff to the folks who have to do the guidelines and the implementation. It's 100 megawatts is being talked about. There's 30% low to moderate income carve out, which is pretty aggressive. And you know, the impact that it could have on New Mexico is tremendous. At the same time, we do have utilities that are not as crazy about this, and so we're kind of watching what will happen. The recs were amended over to the utilities in the last committee hearings, and so I think, you know, we can put some notes in the follow-up to this webinar about how to follow various community solar bills through various states' legislatures. Carly's going to forward my slides for me. So Carly, why don't you go to the next slide? So how we got here. First, how I got here. I think maybe one thing I'll do is not be here. I'm going to close my webcam so that you can see the slides a little bit better. My own background in community solar is that I've been working with co-ops and municipal utilities across the country for many years, solar for a couple of decades, actually many decades, but I don't like to add them all up. So when all of this started, it was a way to promote premium priced solar that the utilities felt that they couldn't invest in on behalf of all customers. That's changed, and I think that that is the main focus of this presentation. Is I wanted to talk about how community solar changes with the market growth and the success that we've actually seen. I think Steph is going to talk about some ways in which they're making tremendous progress in this way to keep community solar vibrant and alive. But it's very different than it was to begin with. It used to be, and in some communities where they don't have solar legislation for community solar yet, it's an investment. It's a voluntary program that you put your money into in order to give the utility maybe a little push in this solar direction. As things evolved in the early 2010s, community solar programs started to implement virtual net metering, and that was a huge difference. You saw on that chart that Gilbert showed, many states are now compensating at the retail rate, and that makes a big difference. Financing innovations came along, and people who were developing community solar as third-party developers, not utilities themselves, but third-party developers, were promoting savings from day one. And that was a huge boost also, I think. It's still true, and if you look at the states that have the most successful community solar programs, that they do still have that policy push, in some cases actually offering particular incentives for particular markets. And those are the focus really of, you know, my remarks today as we get into this high renewables environment, where we're also interested in really addressing equity and inclusion at the local level. There are policies and programs that we can put into place to take us out of that mode of saying, well, community solar is just a side project in order for, you know, solar advocates to be happy, into a mode where community solar contributes in a significant way to the grid. Next slide. So this is a reference to a study that was done a couple years back, but it's still a really good one to look at if you're interested in community solar and you're kind of new to it. Vote Solar and Green Tech Media put this enormous report together. They had some other partners too. Don't want to shortchange anybody, but basically it looked at every angle of community solar and its market development. And one piece is the marketing aspect, of course. So polling folks, you know, it differed a little bit whether you were in the low to moderate income market or the general market, but these were the top line things people wanted. They wanted economic savings. They wanted predictability of costs. The financing options very popular. And then if any of you are in states that have community solar, you know that simplicity of program design is really important, because it can be daunting and discouraging if the program is too complex. People oftentimes would go into community solar because still, as it was from day one, community solar is something that is meaningful to people. It aligns with their personal values. It supports the local economy. It supports job development and all the rest. And now, as I said, you know, more and more we're seeing programs that are especially geared to low to moderate income customers. So let's take a look at what's happening as community solar actually takes off. Next slide. So, you know, you've all heard the news, this fantastic news. Solar costs have dropped more than 70% in the last decade. Solar is in some markets a least cost resource. This really does change things. Oftentimes, when you go into a policy setting, you will hear the argument that savings on a solar share are not significant enough because the cost of solar being low, the energy component of the rate, if that's the way that you're being compensated, is relatively small. Well, I'm going to talk a little bit more about why that is not necessarily the case. But it is certainly a point that is valid to bring up and consider. You can see in the chart below there, and that chart is a little bit out of date, but it was nice. It fit at the bottom of the slide really easily. And it does show that the more solar penetration that you have, if it's PV only, in other words, not enhanced by storage or other aspects of value enhancement in solar project design, that becomes less valuable overall in the market. And that's because you can't escape the reality, you know, that solar is a variable resource. It doesn't always match the needs of the utility, and we've all heard of the duck curve. So now I wanted to caveat any further discussion of this by one important thing. If you're in a state that is just getting started in solar development, this curve that actually is taken from a study of the Cal ISO is not going to be immediately important to you. There's a lot of solar that you could put into a lot of the states in the upper Midwest, for example, or, you know, even much of the country. I think there are, what, 19 or 20 states that have community solar legislation. And even in those states, community solar is just getting started. But in my work, I'm working with a utility that's fairly progressive and is targeting 100% renewable energy during daylight hours. That's Kit Carson Electric here in New Mexico. And they saw within just a few years a complete flip of how important solar congestion was on the grid. So they have to be concerned about these distributed solar projects, as they don't always provide energy resources at the right time. They're working with me now on storage, and so, you know, we could talk more about that. But so if you have a project and it's already bankable, they're not going to take your money because the market changes. The project is secure. But as we look ahead, we have to think about how the market is going to change and how we can make sure that community solar remains a good investment and represents people's values, in the sense that they value making a contribution, not just window dressing. They want community solar to really have an impact. Next slide, please. So this was a little study that I did in relation to a community solar plus storage project in Minnesota. There's also an aspect of this study that where I was working with a current partner, the North Carolina Clean Energy Tech Center. What we did was we looked at the various impacts, both from the utility perspective and from the customer perspective, of doing a solar plus storage project where the customers were benefiting only from the storage project in one regard, which is that there are synergies in things like siting and certain aspects of development. So there's a reduced cost to the overall project on a unit basis for the solar, but the customers were not participating directly in the storage. At the same time, because of, you know, basically good design and whatnot, you could see their benefits far outweigh their costs, even for solar only. But if you look at it from the utility point of view, you can see that when they were just doing solar only, that's the top bar, it does not quite hit 1. And if you got a break-even cost, that's at 1 in a benefit cost ratio. So they had to think of something else. So the solar plus battery is a great investment. The battery reduces wholesale demand charges, which means a lot to the utility, and then they're much more interested in the entire project. Now, they weren't truly a candidate for adding demand response or load management to the puzzle, but I'm a proponent of doing that whenever possible. So since they did have demand response with their commercial customers and some of their larger customers in that area, we said, well, what if we included a 200 kilowatt demand reduction in this project from load management? And you can see that now you're almost pushing it like out there into the beautiful land of a great benefit to cost ratio. Now, there are a lot of practical complications that may cause projects not to exactly unfold, you know, the way that you dream them. But I think that this is an illustration of how layering in modern smart grid type approaches with community solar can turn the picture to something that is far more enduring. Next slide. So how do you accomplish this? And that's what I just alluded to. You can have a great model, a great picture on paper, but you still have to make it happen. And in a lot of state policies about community solar plus storage, people have backed off from putting storage into the community solar bill because they're like, oh my God, we have to work out, how are they going to work this out? There's so many questions. Is the utility going to own the storage? Is the developer going to own the storage? How are they going to compensate for it? A kilowatt hour is no longer a commodity that always has the same value. When it's combined with storage, its value differs because it's like, you know, is it a demand reduction value, or is it simply a value of a kilowatt hour that's generated during a calm day in April, which is generally not a peak time. So here are just some ideas. I'm not even going to go over each and every one of these with you because I don't want to take all that time. But I want you to know that, you know, there are cases in which the utilities are doing this, and then they split the benefits with the customers. So they give the customers a little boost to make sure that the customer gets a better than break-even deal, because they know that their demand reduction or their other storage benefits like ancillary service values or resilience values or whatever make it a better deal for all customers. But the developers can do this too, and I'll show you in a minute. In some states, they're starting to have third-party community solar programs that still get an incentive for doing solar plus storage. There's also the possibility that you could simply require it. In New York, I think they're going that way, where community solar and storage have to happen together. But the community solar customer doesn't necessarily have to even concern themselves with this. It's just, you know, part of what happens in the technical side of the project, and then they get an offer. So it's just nice to know. But with regards to LMI customers, I think it's really important to consider this too, because when you hear that argument that community solar doesn't offer enough savings because of, you know, the relatively low cost of energy compared to the cost of, say, the service charge or, you know, other aspects of paying for T&D, there are ways to supplement your community solar program with energy efficiency, with weatherization, with bundling. And I've actually been working on this concept since I worked for a project for the Department of Energy called the Community Solar Value Project, starting in 2015. So it's not like, you know, we're just dreaming. We've been working on this for a long time. The problem is that somebody has to be willing to do the work of bundling, and you know, it's not always easy, but the customer loves it. And we did some work with Shelton, which is one of the big you know, market research firms that really supported this concept of bundling. Next. So here are just a couple of real quick examples. Massachusetts, I mentioned that there was a state that had a storage adder that credits the developer for adding storage to a project. That's a significant investment, and I'm sure Steph is going to talk about Massachusetts because that's where they're at. New York has tremendous solar plus storage goals. And I've seen a lot of different numbers. I went with the one I was most sure of, which is just an announcement made this month that they're going to be committing to another 15 megawatts of community solar paired with storage. Another example out of New York that I liked a lot is something that's almost like you know, the community choice aggregation model, where the local government kind of acts on behalf of the customers. They had a project there which was community solar plus storage, where they were stepping forward on behalf of all of their residents in the community, and you could opt out if you didn't want to be a part of the project. But that way, it made it really easy for everybody in that community to benefit from this solar plus storage. And then, you know, I just mentioned here that because of that sense of complication that I mentioned otherwise, you see in the legislation nowadays that they say this project may be cited with other energy projects. So they kind of leave the door open for things to happen. Granted, there are not that many states. I read an NREL report about this, which actually kind of over-reported the number of states that have community solar plus storage in a specific programmatic way. But there are a lot of states that are experimenting. And as I said, things are going to change really fast as we try to hit those 80% renewable energy goals. Next. So finally, just a few comments on some actual projects. My partners at the North Carolina Clean Tech Center have done a lot of cool stuff in this regard. Fayetteville, North Carolina, municipal utility, and also Sterling, Massachusetts, another municipal utility that have community solar plus storage. There's a really wonderful example in Roanoke, Virginia, not Virginia, but Roanoke, North Carolina, where they do that bundling. They're very interested in the local economic impact of making the project, even the land on which the solar is sited, can be part of a package that provides benefit to the local community. And then they got some grant money to do weatherization. So when they're already promising that, or at least suggesting that the average low to moderate income customer is going to save over $300 a year through participation in the program. But then they have the weatherization service on top of it, so that you really start to see people in those communities come forward with great interest. It's kind of disingenuous, you know, to offer a long application process for just a few dollars of savings. But when you start to offer something really significant, it impacts the whole community. I had a webinar myself a week ago where we had Orcus Power and Light from Washington State also doing this kind of bundling. In their case, it was a little more gentle. It just had to do with a program that supported energy efficiency for community solar participants, and reaching out even broader to the low to moderate income community. Finally, I did want to mention Sacramento, because I worked like crazy with them on community solar, and it seemed for a while like, you know, they were going with some green power marketing type approaches. They took to this idea of the benefits of storage, and they are one of the pioneers of shared storage. And so that's a program worth looking into, where they do share the benefits of the storage project directly. And my final slide, I hope I'm not going too long, Gilbert. I just wanted to tell you about, you know, what I'm up to. I do have a website thesolarvalueproject.com. It is, as you can tell, a little bit geared towards those states that do not yet have third-party community solar legislation. It focuses on how to develop more win-win relationships with utilities. But we're working with 3 co-ops right now on solar plus storage, and we don't have this page live yet, but we're really excited. We have a modeling tool that can help you understand value stacking, which everybody talks about, but nobody really understands. So maybe I'll come back again and talk to you some more. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Jill. This is Gilbert again. Really appreciate your perspective, all the great work that you're doing, and excited to have you here. I see a lot of questions rolling in that we'll get to in the latter part of our hour as well. But let's roll right into Steph's presentation. Steph, you have about 12, 13 minutes or so, 15 minutes at the most perhaps, and turn it over to you now. I believe you might be muted, Steph.
Of course you are. If we're playing IT bingo these days, that you always have to tell someone these days, hey, I think you're muted. So apologies about that, everyone. My name is Steph Spears. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Solstice. We are a community shared solar company, and we connect households and businesses to community shared solar farms in their community, and then we manage the whole customer experience for the life of the 20-year project. So we handle all the billing and the crediting and the integration with folks' utility accounts in our software. Just confirming, can everyone see the deck so far?
Cannot. It looks like it's just a white green.
Oh, okay.
Let me take this back from you, and then I'll give it to you again. Let's see.
Sure. It worked in the tech check earlier.
It did. It did.
All right. Can everyone see that?
Jill, can you see that? Oh, there we go. Okay. So we see your screen. There we go.
All right.
There it is.
Perfect. So I want to talk about specifically market trends that we're seeing in communities, as well as the market trends we're seeing in regards to energy equity and energy justice. So this is one of our customers, Joan. She's out in New York, and she signed up for community solar. But before she heard about community solar, she told us, I don't think I'm going to sign up because I can't afford it. And we said, actually, it's a guaranteed 10% savings on your bill, so you can't afford it. And it blew her mind that this was possible. She said, I'm a single mom. I don't have much disposable income, and everything extra I use on my family, and I didn't think that I could get clean energy. I never thought I could get clean energy. I always wanted clean energy because I'm an environmentalist. I just thought you had to pay more for it. And that's been the case for many decades, that if you want renewables, you're going to have to pay more for it. And out of the 130 million households in this country, NREL says that 6 million households have green power of some sorts. And the vast majority of green power right now is a premium product. So based on our consumer studies and this insight here is we realize the vast majority of households in America either cannot or refuse to pay a premium for clean energy. So if we're talking about how to get clean energy to 100% of the country, then we have to consider that insight. And that's why community solar is such a good value proposition to low-income Americans, because they don't have to put anything on their home, which means they don't have to own a rooftop, because for a lot of programs across the country, they don't have to pay an upfront cost. And because they're getting guaranteed savings, this is one of the most affordable and accessible types of solar around. But the issue is that not a whole lot of low-income customers are currently enjoying community solar. So first, we'll talk about some market trends about the low-income side of community solar, and then we'll talk about the energy justice side. A market trend that we're seeing a lot of is the increase of community choice aggregation. Jill mentioned this as well. And just as a reminder of what community choice aggregation is, you have an aggregator, and they're using purchasing power of a large group to source cheaper sometimes or cleaner energy for a group of a population. And right now, the majority of the states don't have CCAs, but this is something that we saw got implemented in the last couple of elections, and one will continue to see. And the key about CCAs that make it more accessible than sometimes privately developed community solar is because we're talking about an opt-in versus an opt-out framework. And this is the important policy implication. So when you have an opt-out framework, so everyone is automatically being signed up for community solar, and if they don't want to be a part of it, they have to actually opt out, versus offering community solar to people and then they at will opt in, you get massively more uptake of community solar when people are opting out. And behavioral economic studies show that's because people are very biased towards defaults. And so if you have a product that's giving people guaranteed savings on their bill, well, an opt-out policy framework makes a lot of sense to get more people access to it, because marketing community solar does cost money. And marketing community solar to people, especially in areas where they're highly skeptical of energy companies, like Illinois, for example, a community solar state that has a lot of histories of ARES companies, energy supply retailers, being sued in class action lawsuits for cheating people on their bills. Well, you're gonna need a different kind of policy framework if you want people to sign up en masse, because people are highly skeptical of energy companies there. Other trends we're seeing is both municipality and corporate aggregation as well. So here are a couple of announcements just from the past few months. Few days ago, the Cuomo administration announced that they were doing community solar and storage for local municipalities. Municipalities will be the aggregators. And Microsoft partnered to do 500 megawatts of community solar, in which they're going to be helping finance the project. And so aggregation on the demand side, as well as aggregation on the financing side, will allow for more clean energy and community solar to be built. And the other really interesting trend we're seeing is that there is increasing customer skepticism about greenwashing. So it's not good enough to give people RECs that come from some Iowa wind farm that was built 20 years ago. We need to now hold ourselves to a higher standard of creating additionality in clean energy with our RECs or our consumer products, because customers are getting more and more knowledgeable about this. And the other market trend that we're seeing, and this chart is unfortunately a little old, but it hasn't really been updated for the last few years, and this comes from Green Tech Media, but rest in peace, Green Tech Media. But this shows an increasing trend of utility-led community solar. And that's really important to keep an eye on. And it's also really important that we distinguish between the different kinds of utilities, between IOUs and MOUs and rural co-ops, especially when we're talking about clean energy equity and making this more accessible. You know, we can look at the fact that rural co-ops operate in 90% of the census tracts that are considered have the most poverty over the most number of years. And so rural co-ops are well placed to do something like community solar for both an equity and also helping with their load and generation requirements. Municipal owned utilities as well. They can place community solar closer to where the load is being consumed. And then IOUs tend to be the biggest detractors from community solar historically, but the great trend we're seeing is that more and more IOUs is saying, okay, we should stop trying to wish community solar to go away as an industry, and we should do pilots ourselves, because this industry is not going away, it's growing too quickly. And so we're seeing IOUs do community solar pilots more and more compared to even 2 years ago. Another trend you're seeing is the profusion of interest in energy justice and community engagement. And we're also going to see a lot more effort on the federal policy side in this front. It's no secret that every single climate appointee that in the Biden administration so far has been a longtime historical proponent of environmental justice. And they have an entire group of people at the Department of Energy that are focused on investing in frontline communities, frontline climate communities right now. And it goes without saying that, you know, low-income communities have the highest energy burden. They disproportionately live next to fossil fuel plants. They disproportionately have air pollution. They're disproportionately living in hotter communities, and they're disproportionately locked out of the clean energy market. And that's not just true of clean energy, that's true of community solar too. There have been so few community solar projects built in this country that benefit low-income communities. And we'll talk about the reasons for that more later. But now you're going to start to see more trends around mandating community engagement. Developers and financiers, either mandates or incentives, excuse me. So mandates or incentives to get developers and financiers to actually talk to the people who live in the communities in which they're offering power. You're going to see more calls for community advisory boards, similar to what you've seen in California, in that any kind of clean energy project, if you want certain government funding, you're going to have to create a community advisory board to get people's input from the community on your project. And there's also going to be more funding from pre-development grants. NYSERDA in New York has been really good at leading the charge and creating more grant funding to cover the pre-development costs of doing this kind of work, of doing community engagement. You're also going to see incentives for siting projects in frontline climate communities, because as we know, the vast majority of clean energy projects don't get cited in environmental justice communities, particularly Black and brown ones who are suffering the most from fossil fuel air pollution. And you'll also see more efforts on community ownership. Community ownership of community solar is the egg that no one has been able to crack yet, mostly because the financing is really hard to scale. But there are a lot of people who are trying innovative solutions right now. And in the coming years, we're going to see a lot more models that could be replicable on this front, which is exciting. And it will never, community ownership, because of the way capital flows work, will never be the majority of community solar, but we can certainly do better in making sure that the community is seeing the financial benefits from clean energy projects. Even when you have a low-income project built in, say, Massachusetts or New York, the people who are financially benefiting from that project outside of just the savings, I'm talking about the investors, they're not the people who come from communities. The people who make the most money from clean energy are not the ones who are suffering the most from climate change. And you'll see this start to change in terms of our conversation about energy justice. So why are there so few low-income projects across the country? Why do low-income households lack access to even something like community solar, which is generally in the private markets offered at a guaranteed discount to your utility bill? Well, the answer is risk. Developers and financiers tell us that, I don't want to take on any more risk. I mean, community solar is hard enough to get financed. I don't want to take on any more risk. And I need to have a FICO requirement for my community solar projects because my financiers tell me that I need to have a requirement. And when we looked at the data, we realized, wait, are we talking about perceived risk or are we talking about real risk? Because so few people in our space in community solar have actually quantifiably measured the financial risk of serving low-income customers. And furthermore, we would argue that so few people actually have a good understanding of what LMI means. Professor Gilbert said this earlier, where he said, what are we talking about when we mean low income? And in the energy industry, we tend to paint all low-income people with a broad brush and treat them the same. And the fact of the matter is they're really different. When we're talking about 40% of the country as a family of four earning less than $40,000 a year, so a family of four earning less than $40,000 a year, that's about 40% of the country earning that amount. That's going to encompass people who pay their utility bills on time. And that group is going to encompass people who will never be able to pay their utility bills on time because they lack the funding to do it. Because unfortunately, when you earn minimum wage in this country, you're not able to pay all your bills. And so when we exclude entire populations from enjoying something like clean energy based on risk, we are replicating an unjust system that has historically been akin to redlining. At Solstice, we call this clean energy redlining, because in housing redlining in this country, people were not given mortgages because they were deemed too risky. And we're replicating this entire framework in clean energy. We are not giving clean energy to people because we are deeming them too risky without doing the work to determine what the actual risk is. So how do we get beyond this clean energy redlining? I mean, there's a number of ways to do it. One of the ways that we work on at Solstice is we look to see, okay, there's a FICO requirement for most community solar projects in the country that is third-party developed. How many people meet that FICO requirement? And we saw with a FICO requirement about 680, 700, more than half the country doesn't meet that FICO score. So we're eliminating half the country from getting clean energy and community solar that is generally guaranteed discounts, and that makes no sense. And so we basically looked at all the data that we could find across the country that correlated people's FICO score with their ability to pay their utility bill. And our question was, just because someone has a low FICO score, does that mean that they always don't pay their utility bill? We looked at 800,000 lines of data, machine learning algorithms, and we found that actually, just because someone has a low FICO score does not mean they don't pay their utility bills on time. And surprisingly, just because someone has a high FICO score doesn't mean that they do pay their utility bill on time. And so we invented a new score, and it's called Energy Score. It's more accurate than FICO at predicting who pays their utility bills on time, because it takes in a bunch of demographic data, including your utility repayment history, which is not measured by FICO. And we found that we could also include more low-income customers that would have been otherwise eliminated from the qualification by just looking at their FICO score. And we know in America that FICO scores are your destiny. They determine whether you get a house, they determine whether you get a car, but should they determine whether you get access to clean energy? And we think not. So we can increase access to millions more Americans by harnessing better data and better innovations to rewrite our destiny. We don't have to rely on FICO, which was invented in 1956 and which never measures things like utility payment history, rental history, or cell phone payment history. The last thing I'll say is that utility bills are becoming more and more of a conversation. New York State passed consolidated billing for community solar, but the bill is really an enabling tool to increase access to low-income households in a variety of ways. And you'll see this kind of work with energy efficiency as well, but making sure people have access to budget billing and the software works for utilities to allow people to do that. Making sure people have access to on-bill financing and having the utility software be able to do that as well. And then you could also, this is a little more sophisticated than just on-bill financing and budget billing, but giving customers cash bonuses for using less power during peak moments. And Texas is a good reminder of a situation in which this could have decreased demand or better demand response would have helped the overall load. And in this way, like a great company that's doing this is Ohm Connect out of California. And they told me that most of their customers that choose to use their program, a lot of their customers that choose to use their program are low income, because low income folks say, if I use less electricity tonight, I get a cash bonus. Yeah, sign me up. So there are these innovative programs that we can layer on with community solar and give people more access outside of just energy efficiency, which is normally the go-to. Like Jill said, we need to bundle these benefits so that people see the maximum amount of savings and maximum access to things like clean energy. So this is the America that we're imagining. This is one of the solar farms that we worked on outside of Boston, where we're based. And this used to be a former landfill, actually. So people would go to the building next to it and they would drop off their recycling at the transfer station and they would see mounds of trash. And now they get to see a community solar farm that's available to them and their neighbors. And so this is the America that we're imagining, because this is the America that allows you to get solar even if you don't have the right income, even if you don't have the right home, even if you don't have the right FICO credit score or other markers of privilege. So I'll end here, and thanks a lot for your time, everyone.
Thanks, Steph. That was amazing. I really appreciate your presentation. It was inspiring. We don't have a ton of time. We have 5 or so minutes before the end of the hour to address questions. So let's jump right in here. Jill and Steph. And I'll start chipping away here at the questions. Hopefully you all can see them in the chat as well. Jill, I think this first one is for you. How can we place community solar and microgrid development from a technical and legal point of view? You talked a lot about storage, we know about microgrids. What's sort of the overlap relationship, path forward, et cetera, there from your perspective? I believe you're muted, Jill. Sorry about that.
I see that. I got the message. I haven't really addressed microgrids specifically. We do have one of our partners is working on a microgrid, and in that case, it would naturally be more of a case of separating the microgrid for a specific purpose, which might be for essential services during weather emergencies or things like that, from the community solar project. But again, it's the synergy of the projects. I have no doubt that there will be models emerging specific to microgrids, but that's really not kind of out there. So whoever's working on that, I'd love to hear more.
Yeah, very good. Next question I see here is from Kevin, who is in Longmont, Colorado. I'm not sure if folks are familiar with that town, and it looks like Kevin is in co-op territory. I know that, Steph, you talked about co-ops, and Jill, you've done a ton of work on this, and I have as well, in seeing the co-ops emerge as leaders in the community solar program design world. I'm not sure if either of you are familiar with Longmont or just want to more sort of generally comment on the prospects for community solar through co-ops. I'll turn it over to either of you.
Well, if this is who I think it is out there, it's a great project. Colorado is a wonderful leader in this space, and as you said, co-op innovation. That's another one where I think a hint to put something on the website, perhaps, that I have to hook people up with some of these other great case studies, and we can do that.
Yeah, I'd say that Dave Monk, who's the board chair over at Holy Cross in Colorado, they've done excellent work on community solar integration with their operations, and they've really focused on how to increase access to low-income customers. So he actually sent me a report by the Trade Group for Rural Co-ops about low-income inclusion, and so I can share that with you all, and you can just distribute it to whoever has attended the webinar. But suffice it to say, co-ops, because it is more just inherently, their business model is more community driven, and because they have to answer to their constituents, they don't see their folks as ratepayers, they see their folks as customers. And so because of that, they've done some of the most innovation around community solar. Yeah,
absolutely. I've done a lot of work on this as well in Minnesota. Bark Electric Co-op in Virginia has been pretty renowned for their projects. Jill, next question for you from David. Have you seen examples of water and wastewater facilitating community solar for their customers, using customer investment in the on-site solar projects to help reduce the cost of water services? That's an interesting question.
Yeah, well, I worked on a water project here in Santa Fe some years back, and so it is definitely an area where, if you could have a cookie cutter and do all of the water and sewer plants in the country, it would be great. None immediately come to mind, but I do think that's a model that's just waiting to happen.
Very good. Question from Roger, I think for me, updated slide about community solar states. Yeah, there's NREL has some slides and some reports. I think, if I'm not mistaken, we're up to about almost 20 states that have enabling legislation. And I think Solstice, actually, if I'm not mistaken, makes maps as well, which are incredibly useful on the status of community solar legislation. So I'd point you, Roger, to those resources. Steph, question for you from Tom Stanton. Is Jones served by a competitive utility supply company or by a vertically structured regulated utility company? It would be useful for some of us to talk about how community solar works as an overlay to competitive electricity supply, assuming such relationships exist.
Yeah, and this is not going to surprise anyone, but it's state by state dependent on how it interacts with other competitive retail supply. Minnesota is really the only community solar state that's a regulated state that has a sophisticated community solar market. The other markets are deregulated, and so this is a question that comes up particularly around customers. They say, if I am on another supplier, can I still sign up for community solar? And so we have to educate them. In New York, yes, you can sign up. This is just a layer on top. So you're getting 10% savings on the bill, the credit that is produced by your solar share, and that is applied to your whole bill regardless of your supplier, but it depends on parochial energy regulations.
Gilbert, that brought to mind a news item just recently that Energy Sage has started a page on their service that is dedicated to community solar as a means of directing people from all over the country to the community solar programs that may be applicable to them. And I know a lot of ASES members are familiar with Energy Sage.
Yeah, great resource, good idea. A lot of local innovation and innovation broadly speaking happening around this. So as we're learning from each other how to do community solar, all those resources are great. We're closing in on the hour. I think we have the liberty to go over just a minute or two if folks can bear with us. I see a question from James at 241 here about the potential for adding to the value stack, community solar plus storage, blockchain for energy, Bitcoin. I don't know, Jill, if that's a question for you, or Steph, if you want to address this one.
I want to hear a little more from Steph. And what I was going to ask was, since Massachusetts is such a leader in the storage area, do you have any stories about innovative solar plus storage projects that might be in your state?
Unfortunately, we haven't seen commercially available community solar plus storage, and what we hear from our financier and developer partners is it's not quite cheap enough, the storage options, to include it in and make the project still pencil out. Where we have seen solar plus storage is when it's philanthropically funded, then then we've seen a couple of smaller, less than 1 megawatt projects, but it's not been something at its scale. That's going to obviously change in the next 5 years, which is really exciting.
And I do think that that's one reason why I'm still working with the utility partnership CLIP, because they have a long range view. Oftentimes utilities, and again, primarily munis, co-ops, but also local IOUs such as Xcel Energy in Colorado are interested in learning. And so they're more open to doing these types of projects and making that investment because they know it's part of their future.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you both. Quick question from our ASES friend, Robert Foster. Can you discuss how some utility-led community solar projects may be part of a larger strategy to discourage rooftop solar? Either of you want to address this one?
I can't speak to any utilities that I've spoken to that have identified that as their motivation. It's very much possible. I don't know 3,300 utilities across the country, but I will say that the utilities that I speak to, when they consider and I've spoken to rural co-ops, municipal and utilities, and IOUs, they are talking about doing community solar to really appease their rate base, their customers. Because customers are demanding renewable options. And oftentimes these utility-led programs, especially IOU programs, are offered at a premium. So you're seeing really low uptake or no uptake at all of the programs. And so the IOUs are left trying to figure out, how do we work within our regulatory constraints and offer community solar to either low-income folks or everyone at price parity or a discount. So that's a kind of a puzzle that they're trying to face right now. But I haven't seen them say, of course, they're not going to tell me they're doing community solar so that they can squash Rooftop.
And of course, I have heard that for years now. I think there was some concern about slowing down the train when there was a lot of press a couple of years back about a death spiral of people doing distributed energy resources causing significant revenue erosion at utilities of all kinds. The variety of different options that are available now, I think, give everybody a chance to get this massive transition in motion. And, you know, so it may not have changed in your hometown yet, but there is this sense as we move forward and we have all of these different elements in the puzzle that people are much more open to working together.
Yeah, and the other thing I'd say is that, you know, we are community solar folks, so we're hugely bullish on community solar as a market, but we never propose that it's the silver bullet. Like, we need all of the solutions. We need rooftop. We need to work with rooftop developers. We need utility scale solar, and we need as much distributed generation as possible. So I think that's the exact kind of mentality that Jill, you were describing. That's exactly what we try to proffer, at least in our rhetoric.
Exactly. I think diversity and flexibility is key as we this underfolding broader energy transition, right? We're a few minutes past the hour, and I do have to go actually teach my class on energy and society, which is convenient and timely. And I don't think we're going to be able to get to all the questions. I'll speak for myself and not Jill and Steph, but I'm happy to you know, take more via email and talk offline with folks if appropriate. One question that I see is kind of interesting and maybe is a good tee for you know, final remarks from each of you, 30 seconds each or so, from Mason in Washington State. You know, are there any organizations that can help us support our policy efforts in Washington? Maybe as a case study to zoom in on if you folks are familiar with Washington. If not, maybe more broadly, both of you, how can you get involved in community solar, you know, policy pushes or other ways to deploy projects in your home state? Let's start with you first, Jill.
I'm going to guess that most states, general pro-solar advocacy groups such as Sierra Club have an eye on this thing. There is a coalition for community solar, which takes this kind of issue directly to Washington, and you know, the other groups, there's an Energy Storage Association, Solar Association. ASES does not specifically do lobbying, but I think all kinds of folks are involved. I think that's one reason why I mentioned the Energy Sage website, because it's kind of like very user-friendly and a good way to get information out to the general public if that's your interest.
Yeah, I would say the Trade Organization for Community Solar's community, CCSA, and if you can get connected to your local policy person, there is a policy person that will cover the West in that group.
Oh, and I forgot Vote Solar. Vote Solar as well.
That's exactly what I was going to say. You should talk to your Vote Solar folks because they are on the ground regionally, great organization trying to get more all solar, but also community solar.
Very good. Well, I do want to be respectful of folks' time. Thank you so much, Jill and Steph, for joining us and sharing your perspective and work. I think this was fascinating. I think, Carly, I'll turn it back over to you for a quick final remarks, and hopefully you're saving the questions in the chat, and I'm happy to address more of those after we hang up here.
Yeah, I have all the questions saved in a Google Doc, so I'll be sure to share that with our presenters after our webinar today. I want to thank Jill, Steph, and Gilbert for hosting the webinar with me this month. It's been great to learn more about community solar and about all of your individual projects. So thank you all, and thank you to all of our attendees for being online today. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Till next time.
Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.